give me fire, give me double satisfied.
We know music can be powerful. What do you guys think of when you think of sound in the ocean?
One ping only, please.
Okay, maybe that's not the first thing you think of. It's the first thing I think of, but perhaps something like this, right? These are the songs of a humpback whale. They make some beautiful songs, and they can communicate with each other over great distances using their songs. Or perhaps something like this. Now, these are the clicks of a killer whale in orca. They use these to actually hunt. So they can use these sounds to find individual fish in the water while they're hunting. So while these animals can't see, they use sound to build a picture of their environment. Now also this communication, it's not like we think of, they don't have speech, but you can communicate some pretty complicated thoughts just with sound. So let's take, for example, let's just use 3 simple sounds. So 1, 2, 3, all right? And let's say you just wanted to let everybody know you were happy. You might just right? Or maybe you want to tell somebody a long way away, hey, you gotta come over here. It is super relaxed where I am. It's nice and warm. We're just chilling out. Or, unfortunately, sometimes you might have to warn everybody. You might have to warn everyone around you that there's danger. Anyhow, you guys get the idea, right? These animals in the ocean use sound to see. They build this picture. And what we're going to do as we get into this module is talk about continental margins and talk about sound as that first physical process that we really want to figure out how it works in the water. So stay tuned, grab your notes. I'm going to clean all this mess up, and I'll see you guys back here in a little bit. Welcome everyone to Module 2. As we kick off this second module, I've affectionately titled it The Shallows for all of this. So what that means is, yes, we are still here on planet Earth and talking about the ocean. And while we've covered most of the blue already that you've seen, and it might seem like, what else could we possibly have to cover? We've already learned so much about the ocean. Well, again, we still have 3 modules to go. So what we're going to do in this, like I said, it's called The Shallows, and in this particular lecture, I'm going to talk about the continental margin. And that's where we're going to kind of step off, and the same thing that we did before. We're going to use this and talk about the different environments that are there, the organisms, and all the chemical, physical, and geological processes that occur in this area. So what do I mean by continental margin? Well, all right, if I take my spinning Earth and I zoom in a little bit here, and I strip away all the water, all right, we already know that we've talked about a lot of this, right? A lot of this open ocean. Well, when I say continental margin, I mean sort of this green area here. And actually, the continental margin is specifically defined as the shallow, water-covered edge of a continent. So the edge of the continent that's still submerged. We're going to talk more later on about specifically what I mean by continent and ocean as far as geology is concerned. But for now, you can just think of this as, again, like I said, this green part. This is still continent. It just happens to be covered with water. So in the continental margin, we are still going to be completely covered with water. And you'll see that, Module 3 actually gets into the shoreline. So for now, if we look back at our diagram of our different zones in the ocean, like I said, we've already covered the pelagic realm, and that is most of the ocean and a lot of those big processes. And then you'll see here is benthic, right? That's all the bottom. Now, when I say continental margin, I'm kind of talking about from like here over here, all right? So this is still covered with water, but there's sunlight. It's not dark yet, all right? And there's a lot that goes on. In fact, some of the most amazing communities, and some that you guys might already be familiar with, occur in this area, in the continental margin. So first of all, coral reefs, right? Some of probably if you go onto Google and you Google the ocean, right? I mean, you're going to get some surface ocean, but anything underwater is pretty much going to show you stuff like this because, hey, the rest of the ocean is just blue or dark. There's not a lot there until you get really specific. But coral reefs, these are beautiful. These are abundances. This is an area with an abundance of life. And what is actually a little bit weird is they tend to occur or tend to be in regions that don't otherwise have a lot of life. They're almost like little oases in the desert. And they actually occupy less than 0.1% of the world's ocean. So that's right, you know, that massive area that we've already covered, 0.1% are these coral reefs. In fact, you can see a picture here, the areas in red are coral reefs, and they occur around the tropical regions of the planet. And even in the tropics, it's still only about 1% of the tropics. But they contain at least 25% of all marine species. And that is because, like I said, this is an area where there's not necessarily a lot of life. But because of their shape, because of where they occur in the currents, there's this rapid nutrient cycling, so life can flourish there. The next one that you may or may not be familiar with, depending on where you've been around the world or Googled, are these kelp forest beds. Okay? So kelp forest beds are another environment where, again, life thrives. They provide shelter for organisms. They provide food. You know, these macroalgae, and we'll get into more specifics about exactly, you know, algae. We talked a little earlier, you know, algae are these eukaryotic photosynthesizers that have all of their processes contained in each cell. So they can photosynthesize, absorb nutrients. But these macroalgae, these massive kelp beds, and they carry out between 2 and 5% of the ocean's primary productivity. And you'll see, you know, next lecture we'll actually get into more about what primary productivity is, but that just means making food. So all the green plants that make food for the planet. Another photo you can see here where the kelp forest beds occur. Now, they're similar. They don't occupy an incredible amount of the ocean, and you can see that they're actually skewed a little more towards the colder regions. So while those coral reefs sat right there in the tropics, the kelp forest beds are a little further apart. Let's see, the next one that we're going to talk about in the shallows, and just a little bit here, this is quite similar to the others, are these seagrass beds. And if you've ever been out here in Narragansett Bay, maybe over in Jamestown, you're probably pretty familiar with this. You've seen this underwater. And these are different than algae. These are grasses. These are flowering plants. These are more like plants you would see on land. And again, same sort of thing. They provide an environment for organisms to hide in, be protected, to live in, to eat. A lot of the reason these kelp forest beds are up here in Narragansett Bay is they provide that area of shelter for juvenile organisms to grow. So if you remember when we talked before about plankton, you have those meroplankton. They don't always spend their entire life as plankton. These are juvenile organisms. Well, these seagrass beds are a great place for them to grow up and not be eaten until they can make it on their own. But importantly, these seagrasses are different than algae. So just a couple differences here. These grasses are flowering plants, right? They have roots. They have those xylem and phloem, I'm not sure exactly, right inside the seagrass there to carry nutrients back and forth. They have specialized cells that do these processes, unlike an algae, which sort of does everything itself. And where they have roots, you know, if you saw back in those algae photos, it looked like algae, you know, those giant kelp plants had root systems, but those are something called a holdfast. They really just attach to rocks. There's no nutrient absorption that goes on as opposed to these seagrass beds. All right, so those are some of the environments, and like I said, next time we're really going to talk about this primary production, so I'll leave that going forward, but really all of these green organisms are going to be really important for that. Well, let's see. Let's figure out exactly what this continental margin is before we move on a little bit more. So a continental margin, again, this is just a sideways profile, and oh, by the way, this picture right here is relatively important to your next homework. Anyhow, so continental margin, that's going to be the area from here all the way out actually to deep ocean. Now this distance from shore is average, right? So we've got, 850 kilometers, it says. Don't worry about that number, that's sort of arbitrary. What makes up the continental margin, again, that submerged area still of the continent, are three main areas, and we're going to break these down. The first one is the Continental Shelf, then you have the Continental Slope, and, wait for it, the Continental Rise, all right? And what makes these different is the Continental Shelf, again, is this upper area, right? Very gradually sloping area of the continent. Still covered in sunlight. Your slope there, it'd actually be something like maybe the drainage in a parking lot, right? Not very steep. Then you have this Continental Slope, and I know it's a weird term, slope, when it's actually the most rapid change on the continental margin in depth. So you can see it's where this just begins to curve very, very rapidly as you break off, all right? And that, honestly, that slope, even though it's really fast as far as this figure is concerned, is more like your steepest highway that you would drive on. And then you have your Continental Rise. And what makes the Continental Rise different is, yes, you still have some of that steep drop-off, and then it flattens out to the deep ocean, but it's this right here, this sediment, all right? And again, we'll get into the specifics of sediment later on, but for now, it's basically just particles that sink to the bottom. It could be runoff from the continent, it could come right down from the water, but it piles up here. It's this nice area where it piles up, and that's your Continental Rise. So you definitely need to know where the continental margin is, be able to kind of draw this figure, tell me about each one of these sections. There's a little bit more in your book if you want to read about it and what distinguishes them one from another. Now, just like I showed you with the atmosphere, this is a bit of an exaggeration, okay? We make these drawings to be able to study them. But if you'll notice, this distance from shore in kilometers, 100's here. Well, in depth, this is only 5.5-ish kilometers deep, which would only be like right there. It'd be really close. So this is an exaggeration. What this really looks like, this massive drop-off, all this great distance and steep movements of sediment, is something like this. So if I take and I shrink it down and I put it above my head, you can now barely see that line, all right? And there's that Continental Rise, that really steep drop-off is right there, and then it flattens out. So this is just nothing more than to give you an idea of some of these exaggerations that we show in the ocean. Remember, the ocean itself and the atmosphere and land are all just a very thin film on the outside of the Earth. Also, what you'll notice here is that, especially looking at it here, this is pretty shallow and fairly flat. So something else about the coastline of the continents and where this continental margin is it changes. All right, so this figure is just showing you the U.S., and it's showing you a couple different coastlines. So actually, if you go, kind of all the way out, this light blue, that is all continental margin, right? That's still continent, I should say, not all continental margin, because it's not always covered in water, but it's still continent. And this coastline moves, all right? So this sort of blue area with the black outline, that might look familiar. That's basically our coastline now. You see Florida, and then we're up here, right there-ish. And it changes. So actually this red line, all right, we talked about ice ages last time. That red line is at the time of the last ice age when all that water was trapped in glaciers. Well, now the sea level was lower. And because that continental shelf is so gradually sloping, well, that actually pushes the coastline out quite a bit. In fact, you can see right here, here in Rhode Island and Block Islands out there, here at the University of Rhode Island, they actually have archaeological sites. So oceanographers go out and they do archaeology because some of those Native American settlements are underwater around Block Island. Block Island used to be a mountain. Not a mountain so much, but it was a high point in the topography. So people lived out there. They lived way out here. The other reason they lived way out here is because there was a massive glacier that took up a lot of the North America there. So they didn't really have a choice. The other thing you'll see is there's this other line, right? This green. This is a projection. All right? This is if all of that ice melted. All of our glaciers in the north and south polar regions melted. Well, no more Florida. You can see the coastline get inundated quite a bit up here. not as much where we are, and not much out in California. And that has a lot to do with the shape of these. You might already know Florida's pretty flat in some of these areas down here, whereas we live a bit on a rocky coastline. So from shore to your house is a pretty great change. So that's why that moves around a bit. Okay, so that's the continental margin, right? And those are some of the organisms that live there. But how do we know this? All right, and this is going to get into sort of our extension of our discussion about one of the processes in the ocean. But how do we know it looks like this? How do we know the whole ocean floor looks like this? This is awfully detailed. And we already said we can't see into the ocean, not very far anyhow. We certainly can't sit on the surface and see the bottom and see all these ridges. And again, see the coastline there. There's your continental margin. So how do we know this? Well, because this is continental margin and sound, and we've already talked about sound, we're going to take a cue from our whale friends and use sound, because in the water, sound is much more useful than light for being able to see. And the way we do that is with our fancy oceanographic research vessels. All right? So here's a vessel, and what they will do is they'll actually project sound down into the water. It'll bounce off the bottom and come back. And what we can do is, with computer algorithms, actually start to build a visual picture of what this looks like. So let me show you what I mean. So if I start this boat up here, you'll see they'll start to project this beam into the water. And I think I might meet Mac's GIF animation again. We'll see how this goes. And as it moves along, it gets that bounce back and starts to build a picture. All right? And what you can see is the more red regions here are shallower, so they're closer to the surface. And then you get to the blues and greens, and it's deeper. And because of this, we can start to build some incredible pictures of what's going on underwater. All right, we can see coastlines in vivid detail. All right, so here's, I don't know, something. But you can see right along the edge, you can see exactly what it looks like. Now, this isn't visible with light, right? You can just stick your face in the water and see this. In fact, we can see things like shipwrecks. Right? You can drive over a shipwreck and see them in great detail from the top, just based on the difference in depth from the top of the ship to the ocean floor. In fact, there are certain types of sonars that can see even better detail. So this picture here is a shipwreck on its side. And you can see all the spars and towers and all smokestacks and all kinds of stuff on here. And then you'll notice what looks like a shadow, this dark area. Well, it is a shadow, but it's not a light shadow. It's a sound shadow. So this is something called side scan sonar. And you have to be very close. So this is a device that will actually be in the water, riding close to the ocean bottom and shoot sonar to the side and build these incredibly detailed pictures. In addition to shipborne sonar, we can actually see a little bit what the floor looks like from space. Right? So you can remember our slight discussion about gravity, so the Earth pulls everything with mass towards it. Well, we already know that water has mass. So when there are changes in the ocean floor, say you have a mountain here, well, that is actually going to have its own gravity, and it's going to pull the ocean water to it. So you'll actually get these changes in sea height based on the gravity of the ocean floor below it. Now, this isn't as detailed as something like the shipborne sonar that I showed you before, but it's global, and it helps us to build a picture. All right, so this photo here is actually taken from a satellite, and you can see, again, not quite as detailed, but you can see some massive seamounts. And what we can do with this information is go, wow, well, there's something really interesting here, and then take our ship and drive over it and get a much more detailed picture. But with all of this, all the mapping, satellites and ships, we start to build this picture, and we end up getting something like this. Now, there is a lot of artistic interpretation here. This is what cartographers do. We haven't mapped the entire ocean floor at all by any stretch of the imagination. But we've mapped enough that we can start filling in the gaps, and we can start to get an idea. Also based on, a very detailed picture of one area the Earth looks like. Well, these processes are very similar. So, hey, maybe we see a couple things that are similar, and we can kind of fill in the gaps. But that's how we get to that. So how does this work? How do the ships actually know how deep the water is using sound? Well, let's go back and let's take our picture of our ship here. And what ends up happening is the ship will send out a signal, all right? And that signal will bounce off the bottom and it will come back. Pretty simple. This is actually something you guys probably already know how to do. So let's see, if I were to ask you, all right, I want you to get in your car and I want you to drive 60 miles an hour in a straight line for an hour. How far have you gone? 60 miles. You guys probably already know that. And that's basically the same thing we're doing here. So your distance, right, 60 miles, is equal to your speed times the time. So we went, we're looking for distance. We went 60 miles an hour for 60 minutes, or sorry, for an hour. And we end up going 60 miles. And this is the same thing here. We just switch distance for depth. We switch speed for velocity of sound in the water. And we still have time. Now, the only caveat here is we do have to divide time by 2 because the total distance is down and back, and we're only concerned with half of that. We're only concerned with the distance down because that would be water depth. Okay, that sounds pretty simple. So how do we measure these things? Well, time, stopwatch, pretty easy. I mean, granted, on ships now we just have, the computer will hear it and time it. There's a clock in the computer. And velocity, we need to know the speed of sound. Well, that starts to get a little tricky in the water. So unlike in the air, where the speed of sound it changes a bit with temperature, but it's pretty stable around 340, 350 meters per second. And I already told you earlier that speed of sound in the water is about 4 times faster than that, right? But it's not as constant. So in the water, you end up with a speed of sound with depth that looks something like this. So yes, your average-ish, if you want to call it, speed of sound in the water is about 1,500 meters per second, which is a little more than 4 times that in the air. But it changes, and it has these strange curves. And this profile here is actually pretty typical of deep water. So what is it that makes this? Well, that's what we're going to figure out. How do we figure this out? Since we can't measure it, we have to know these properties of the water to be able to effectively employ our sonar. So let's step back. Let's figure out this figure. And we're going to start with a couple things you guys already know. So this speed of sound is affected by 2 main things, by this proportionality equation here, or here. I'm not sure where I'm going to decide to put that. And that is that velocity is proportional to the pressure over the density. And what proportional means is it's not an exact, right? It just means that as one parameter goes in a certain direction, the other one goes in the other direction. So the fact that pressure's on top means that as pressure goes up, velocity goes up. And the fact that density's on the bottom means as density goes up, velocity goes down, all right? Sort of like a seesaw. So that's all that means is one goes up, the other one either goes up or down. So let's break these parameters apart. And let's talk about density first. I know we just got done seeing that both temperature and salinity affect density. And I made you guys figure this out with your figures, and maybe a little bit painful. And I'm going to do something kind of annoying is I'm going to remove that salinity. So yes, salinity does affect density. And we've seen before that the surface salinity around the planet can vary quite a bit. However, at a certain location, it doesn't change that much. And temperature is a much greater effect. So what we're going to do is we're just going to stick with temperature, all right? So we know that temperature, again, is inversely proportional to density. So high temperature means low density. Here's your thermocline, which is the same as a pycnocline, and so on and so forth. So we're going to stick with temperature. Now pressure. Well, here's another one. We know our hydrostatic pressure equation. We know that it has to do with density, gravity, and the depth of the water. Okay, here's another one. So yes, it does affect density, and I just said density affects the speed of sound in water. However, in this equation, depth has a much, much bigger effect. Effectively, density doesn't matter when pressure changes. So what we're going to say is pressure is pretty much linear with depth. Pressure goes up as depth goes up, or goes deeper. Pretty simple. We're just going to keep it that way. All right, so we're going to take these 2 things and we're going to build our sound speed profile. And I'm going to start in the surface zone. So this is that zone where the density, or in this case temperature, doesn't change that much. It's pretty straight, and pressure goes up a little bit. So if Density doesn't really change that much. That means that the bottom of the proportionality doesn't really move. But pressure goes up, so then in this case, we're going to have the speed of sound go up a little bit. And then on our next section, we're now in that thermocline or pycnocline, right? That area of rapid density change. And in this case, density is now going to overpower pressure in this area, all right? Because it changes so rapidly. So because temperature is going down, density is going up, sound speed is going to do the opposite. In this case, it's going to start to curve back, right? It's going to start to slow down. Then we get to our next section, all right? Now we still have temperature going down a little bit, but not as quickly, so pressure's starting to catch up a bit, all right? So this curve starts to curve the other way, all right? That starts to slow down and it starts to get ready to the speed to go higher. And then finally, we have our last zone. As we know in the deep ocean, temperature, salinity, density pretty much stays the same, and it's all really driven by pressure. And as pressure goes up, the speed of sound goes up, and you get this curve. So this is how you get that typical profile of the speed of sound in the water. And I say typical because all of these things can change, but I want you guys to understand this. So if I were to ask you to explain each one of these parts, you got to tell me basically exactly what I just showed you. All right, why are these changes here? Now that we've seen this, something else really, really important about sound is lazy. Sound does not want to travel fast. It wants to go as slow as possible. So what's really interesting in the water, because we have these differences, is sound's going to try and stay in the slowest velocity possible, which is right here. And you'll see in this area, we sort of create this safe zone for sound. So what ends up happening is sound will curve as it travels through the water. And this actually allows sound to travel incredible distances in the water, which is how those marine mammals communicate over very, very long distances. So it looks a little bit something like this. So here's our, don't worry about the top too much, they're just showing you this sound channel here, right, where sound is lazy and it's the slowest. And so that source of sound, one whale may call to another, and it's going to travel, all right, in that sound channel to be received by another marine mammal across the planet. Now, oh, by the way, I did get this from the internet, so I don't think I'm giving away any secrets here, but, you know, if you wanted to hide from something, staying out of that sound channel is a pretty good idea. Anyhow, all right, so now we've gone into the shallows, we've talked about the continental margin, some of the environments that are there, and we've already talked about our first oceanic physical parameter, and that's sound. So going forward, we're going to tackle different parameters as they come along. So just like I always say, you know, do the readings ahead of time, watch the videos, take notes as you do them, have your homework out while you're doing that, and don't forget to contact me, email me, come to office hours, ask questions. I want you guys to learn this stuff, and I do want you, to get the grade that you're after, so make sure you reach out to me. So until then, enjoy this video, enjoy the stuff that you're learning, and I will see you guys next time for primary production.